helping with the rebuilding of the Four Arms home planet after the halflings had been told to, quite simply, go away, would take time. It would take time, it would take a lot of sweat, a lot of materials, possibly some blood, but it would definitely need personnel. Many, many human volunteers would head to this planet simply to aid in the reconstruction. This confused their four-armed compatriots as they realized how nasty humans had been before. Humans, these scrawny little bipeds, had been able to go and take them down, fight them so well, take down an entire invasion force and still keep going. And now they were coming to help make sure that their species was well maintained. This was surprising to all of them, but it was a welcome sight, especially since those that survived the invasion and liberation were not in very good shape. Many of them would spend several days inside medical tents just getting IV after IV and meal after meal, trying to get them back into some sort of shape. I know they say round is a shape, but they weren't round. They were basically straight lines, as there was nothing to them. Some of them were so far below body weight that they actually had to be put into coma, induced so that they would not move around as their body began to take in the nutrients given. But you had to be very careful with this. Just like dealing with anyone who has not eaten in a long time, if you simply fill their stomach, they will eat and eat and eat until it kills them. So they had to be very careful. And during this time, humanity got to work. Ships came down all over the planet with prefabricated buildings, landing as close to cities as they could, bringing down with them all sorts of heavy equipment as they began to move rubble, move old buildings, clear roads, rebuild bridges, set up their underground power supplies so that everything could work. Eventually, humans would bring in their zero-point generators, even though it's not really a generator, to hook up inside each of the house. This one device, the Four Arms, had worked on something, but never anything this small. But this one device changed them all, changed the way they lived, as they no longer had to link into their houses like some sort of strange hive. They seemed to only want to do this as a way of tradition anyway. As it turns out, each of the Four Arms began to take on characteristics similar to humans the more they worked with them. At first, most of the Four Arms wanted to stay together in groups, but eventually would begin to work on their own or simply in pairs, many times paired with a human, and they would end up getting close, usually as friends and drinking buddies and so forth. But through that whole thing, there was something that everyone knew was going to happen, but everyone thought it would take longer. Eventually, the fact that more four-armed females, approximately 5 to 1 compared to males, had survived the invasion and occupation and liberation of their home planet and home sector, this was going to lead to some very large problems. In particular, when you have a small group like this, inbreeding is going to be a very major problem. The females seemed to understand this very well. So did the males, so they didn't take it too personal when a few of the females started to get a little close with the humans. Although it was more of a running gag than anything else whenever one of the four-armed females would get close to a human, thinking they were so nice, so helpful, just for the human to finally raise their visor and show that the human inside was female as well. It was also another one when it was a male looking onto a male, and then the human called them something. It was a strange human word that they didn't understand. It didn't translate either, but apparently was a very strong insult. And then simply turned and went back to work. The four-armed folks were always confused when this happened, but understood that it is the way it is, and mistakes happen. All in all, the Reconstruction went by almost like clockwork. More and more humans showed up to aid the four-armed folks in making sure their planet was put back together. Not only did they repair their buildings, their infrastructure, and all others, but they also began to help with the farmland. Many human farmers showed up with tons and tons of equipment, making sure they strictly used the native soil, the native seed, and all the native flora and fauna. They did not bring their own, ever. The only thing they brought of their own was fertilizer, and a lot of it. They had to refertilize the land, as the land had been worked too hard under the yoke of slavery. This was always a problem, and humans understood it very well. The forearm folks didn't understand this, even though they used to be slavers themselves. They used to simply beat a few more of their slaves until production improved. But it doesn't work that way. This is farming after all. There's always an X, Y, Z, and an N factor going on. Once they realized this, and they finally got crops to grow, things got so much better. Many humans wanted to stay on the forearm planet, and were welcome to, but only in certain amounts, as the forearms did not want their planet to become a simple human colony, and they were visitors on their own home planet. This was understandable, and a council was brought together. The human delegation brought up this concern and told them that they would limit the amount of humans that showed up. They would gladly do this to make sure there was no difficulties anymore, as they were now allies, compadres, friends with each other. The forearm delegation did not fully understand this at first until the translator finally caught up. At least the word allies was enough to help them. Not only this, but they had shown that they were more than willing to fight alongside the humans. And one of the human generals stood there, stolid and proud, and simply stated how that though the forearms were once our enemies, they have stood side by side with humans, and they have shed blood equally. And those who shed blood with me shall be my brother, he said. The forearms, fully understanding most of the English by this point, understood this, and there was many a wet eye in the house, especially that of the Empress. The Empress of the forearms simply stood there, although she trembled. She did also have a request. She wanted at least one or two humans to be on her version of a cabinet, her circle of advisors, it was difficult to pronounce. I can't even try now. It is their language after all. And of course, they have two separate tongues, so it does make things a little difficult. With that, the humans agreed, but they would be very selective on who they would send. The Queen/Empress there decided that she would have to interview to let them know who would be allowed, and eventually settled on a simple ensign, one who was looking to be promoted. This one had come in and fought side by side with one of her family members, and had actually freed not only a few more of the family members, but had personally carried her niece, one who was barely 3 or 4 planetary cycles out of her egg, and put it in the Empress's hands when the liberation happened. This was such a sign of respect for them that humanity almost couldn't wrap their head around it. Almost. And while this was happening, they realized that, well, maybe they're not so different after all. Eventually, making sure the planet was survivable, much of the human military began to pull away. However, this had its own issues. You see, the forearm females began to get a little too close to human males and started to actually try and produce. Unfortunately, it succeeded. And now human blood is intermixed permanently inside their society. It's easy to tell them apart, of course. They're usually a little shorter, much stockier, but a whole lot stronger. It was kind of a running joke that they would simply be caught in the forearm's web. Whenever you heard the old poem, "Welcome to my home," said the spider to the fly, was always said with a little bit of a grin. Always said slightly so that someone would realize, yep, he's fucking one of them. But with that, they realized that it would be a simple matter of the war brides from back in the day. Eventually, they would be moving to Earth, as they would realize that life is a bit better there. Or one of the colonies, that is. Over on the halflings' homeworld, things were messy but survivable. They made sure that things were still working. And of course, the humans did show up every once in a while just to show up and say, "Hi, how you doing?" Unfortunately for the humans who showed up, many times they were accosted, not in a bad way. They were simply shown extreme hospitality that was well beyond the halflings' capacity, as their planet had been basically shut down. At least they were starting to come back to it. Eventually, they got used to being treated this way, but started to bring their own gifts. And by gifts, this would have to be large supplies of things like grains, foods, maybe some sort of generators or something along those lines. Anything to help them out. Humanity's not total monsters after all. We're just demons. And it was on one of these visits that the Empress of the Halflings once again came up to one of the humans and offered that one of them marry her so that they could be part of the royalty. Again, the humans refused, even though it was clear to see on a few of their eyes that they were thinking about it. But then again, there was an issue they didn't want to think about. The idea that maybe if they were to be, say, married to the Empress, they worried that they might actually hurt her incidentally. The halflings being so small, it was actually very common during the invasion for one of them to quite literally be punted a good 20 feet. This was funny when thought about the first time, at least during battle, but you wouldn't want to accidentally do that to one of the kids running around. So many of the humans simply stayed clear. And while they did, they continued to talk the wonderful world of politics that nobody seems to enjoy. But while this was going on, a few of the halflings tried to get human DNA to try and mix into their own. If they didn't try to get it through saliva or accidental cuts on someone's hands, they would try to get it from any type of epithelials from the skin. The halflings were not stupid. They were very, very smart. Just not smart enough to take on somebody who was twice their size with the same amount of technology. In their search for the DNA, eventually they fell down to the old standby of being able to mix in genetic codes. At least they believed it should be possible. Considering humans and halflings are very similar in appearance, and seemingly very similar on internal structure, being that one heart, two lungs, intestinal tract, liver, and all the other fun standbys that they all have, they figured, why the hell not? And at one of the parties, they got much of the human delegation, along with their guards, extremely intoxicated, which seemed to take a long, long time. The humans seemed to be able to take the bottles of what they call greg. The humans call it grog, because of its flavor apparently is not very good, for lack of a better term. It's not palatable really for humans, but they seem to simply grab the bottle, pull the cork out the top, flip it upside down, and be able to drink it down in just a few moments and simply ask for another. They seem to enjoy the sensation of the ethyl alcohol that's in it. They didn't seem to be bothered by it, as they put 12, 14, 24 of these bottles down within a matter of an hour. The halflings were amazed at this. Note to self, never get in a drinking contest with humans. Eventually, the grug kicked in. And when it did, the humans had difficulty. As long as they were sitting down, they were fine, but as soon as they got up, they immediately fell over. If they were standing up and decided to sit down, immediately they would fall over. It seemed to not affect them until this change in height happened. And this is what the halflings were waiting for, especially with the security detail. The security detail simply flopped down. And, well, the halflings went to work. Many of the security detail, when interviewed later, would say they barely remember anything. They do remember seeing some very interesting sights, but it was like they were beyond intoxicated. In fact, they were able to see what was going on, but they were also unable to move. They could feel everything. Their sense of touch wasn't gone. Their sense of taste was shot, which was, at least in one instance, they could say that might have been a good thing, considering where the halfling was. Well, where she was sitting, that is. And then they explained what had happened, and this put all the human delegations in an uproar. The halflings didn't understand what they had done wrong, as this was how their culture actually operated. The females simply grab a man and take them. That is what they are. They are a very matriarchal society. Men are there as drones. They're there to fight and to work and to be chosen as mates every once in a while. But that's pretty much all a man ever does. They don't hold any political power. This kind of still pissed off the humans. The fact that they called it a strange word that they didn't understand. They simply called it forcing. Well, the halflings still did not understand what they did wrong. But humanity was a little mad at this. At least for a little while, until the snickering and the jokes came into play. The humans, after all this, began to get a reputation for the most hedonistic race out of all of them. It was believed that many of the humans would simply make jokes, say one thing, how it was completely disturbing or disgusting, and then in the next moment turn around and do the actual act that they said was so disgusting. Well, it wasn't disgusting for very long, as eventually halfling space became a vacation place. Many of the folks that visited obviously were there for only one idea, one thing to do, and do it a lot, many times, as much as possible before they completely passed out, and then they'd wake up and do it again. Humans were noted for this. However, it wasn't long before the halflings were put a little back. They found that, unfortunately, they couldn't conceive through humans. They were a little put back by this. A little bit more than you would think. But this also made it possible for them to, shall we say, increase their availability for vacations. Humanity, not at war, was very into whatever pleasures they could get. They had to be, because they never knew what was going to come next. Even though humanity was basically immortal now, thanks to zero-point quantum energies, it still didn't mean they didn't enjoy the pleasures. No. In fact, tourism became the new ideal. Humans would come in with all sorts of supplies, all sorts of items for the forearms or the halflings, and it became a strange triad, as the forearms and the halflings would show them all sorts of exotic materials, all different types of exotic plants. Many of them were at different beaches, climbed different mountains. Sometimes it was something that even the local population couldn't do, but the humans insisted on doing it. Not only would they climb these mountains, but they would get a running start and jump off using just a simple piece of nylon to make sure they didn't splat on the ground. Many of the forearms and the halflings did not understand this. Why in the hell would humanity do that? And humanity simply had one answer for them. Chemicals. They were confused. Could you explain that? Well, dopamine is the pleasure chemical. When they go and spend some quality time with you, dopamine is released in very large quantities. Not only that, but also doing something like enjoying a meal or accomplishing some sort of task like climbing the mountains or whatever, that's dopamine. However, a bigger thrill is adrenaline, something that scares the living crap out of you. One of the forearms actually asked, why would they want to put excrement in their own pants? That doesn't make sense. No, that's a slang. I'm sorry. Let me explain. The higher the thrill, the more adrenaline is released. Adrenaline just feels really good. Now, if you watch this video here, you can see where small doses of dopamine and adrenaline are released, all for something as a simple workout. They showed a video of somebody lifting heavy weights, and when they were done, ah, ah, the man yelled as he flexed his muscles. Both the forearm ambassador and the halfling ambassador seemed to kind of move around slightly in their seat as they saw the massive muscles of this human being flexed. Suddenly, the human ambassador very quickly turned it off, realizing what was happening. And that is what happens. We humans, we enjoy this, but we have to be careful. If we overindulge, we don't feel it anymore. But going to your planets, even though we're working most of the time, spending our money, spending our resources to go to your areas and have some fun, they get a huge dopamine and adrenaline release. They were still confused, but seemingly agreed, but surprisingly, things like this brought the halflings and the forearms closer together. They were no longer enemies. In fact, it was very common to see them operating in trade. And with this, the triad was complete. The final connection was made. And all three were at peace. They all had huge sections of space. The humans had stretched out for 4 sectors, beyond their own, of course. And then the halflings still had their half a dozen. Forearms had to retake theirs, which was 4 in total. But this still allowed for a lot of growth in any direction. This allowed for all the different governments, all the different religions, all the different ones to fall into place. And it was a glorious time. And it was time for everyone to enjoy the peace. Because peace doesn't last. It was on the far side of the human sector when they found a large group of synthetic vessels coming in. These synthetic vessels were immediately caught on any sensor that was pointed in that direction. And immediately other sensors were pointed that way to see what was coming in. They looked to see what could be coming. To their surprise, it was another group of ships. These were not part of the triad. They had their own distinct look. They looked, well, sleek, for lack of a better term. They were almost aerodynamic. In the way they moved through space, they seemed to glide. Humanity initially shuddered. Then they sent out a word, a communication. Hello. Welcome to human space. Can I help you? They didn't receive a response for several human days. Humanity simply waited. They knew that these folks received the signal, but it's possible that their translators just were not able to figure it out yet. So they continued to wait as these ships moved into a distant human sector, one that barely had any colonies on it. Humanity waited. They realized that a group this large could be a colonization group, but this could also be a warband. They didn't know. So they readied the fleet. They didn't know anything until they saw another group break off and head straight into halfling territory. They didn't realize at first, but when you looked at the map, you realized that all they had to do was turn slightly and they would actually reach a halfling planet before they even reached a human-owned planet. They watched closely. They sent a few more messages. Please tell us your reason for being here. Please respond. Hello, this is humanity. Please respond. They had got 0 response. They knew for a fact that these transmissions were getting there as they sent them on probes, and the probes were actually captured by these ships and brought on board. They had sent a strange type of craft with several long appendages to grab a hold of the probe and bring it inside one of their ships. So they knew that this species was getting the message. So they watched. Word was passed around to the triad. Who was this? Who were they? No one knew. The halflings had never come across this species, and the forearms definitely wouldn't know because it was on the opposite side of human space compared to them. Plus, they hadn't reached out that far either. But they all watched as the halfling colony came into view of the ships. The ships slowly came towards the planet and then seemed to stop just inside lunar orbit and just stayed there. Many messages were sent up from the surface and were also sent from space asking them to respond. Eventually, one ship was sent, a human ship, a very small corvette, only armed with point defense systems, so not as to spook anyone. And they would send over and find out what the hell was going on. Along with that, the halflings had sent a small flotilla of their own, 4 ships in total, 1 destroyer, and 3, if you want to call them corvettes, because they might as well just be cargo haulers at this point, had been sent over as a delegation. They also wanted to be there in case they had to evacuate their own people. And this was probably the smartest thing they did. Because as the ships came up, sending all sorts of messages claiming that they were from either the halfling race or from humanity, asking the other ships to respond, without hesitation, those ships launched several other small ships from their belly and dropped towards the planet. This was no colonization. You attack with that many, this is a frickin' invasion. With that, the humanity's corvette tried to turn and burn to get out of there, but it was almost too late. Everyone watched as the ship itself was fired upon by several different types of energy weapons. There was also some sort of projectile that whipped past. The pilot was good, was very good, but no one is that good. Eventually, the ship was hit hard enough that the engines went offline and it went adrift. With that, the halfling battle group went to the other side of the planet, trying to keep away from this new assaulting force, and shot their cargo ships towards the surface as fast as they possibly could. Although not nearly as fast as a human ship, they did make good time to the surface. They screamed a warning for everyone to get ready for evacuation, and the human ship that was disabled could only sit there and watch as all the cargo ships were fired upon. It didn't matter if they were on their way to the surface, loading up with civilians, or just trying to get the hell away. Their destroyer tried everything it could to fight them back, but it was just too outgunned. With this, humanity knew what to do. Humanity flipped the switch. They were at peace before, and they enjoyed it. But you know what else humanity loves? They love war. And the call went out to all 3 in the triad. Ready the fleets.